Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back with the new episode of Stories. I am Bella, a wanderer of the night and a collector of the darkest tales. This is Belladarktales, where I share stories that will haunt your dreams. Without wasting time, let's start with today's stories, which I selected for you. Let's start with our first story. First story is sent by a subscriber from Montana. They asked not to mention their name. Let's read in their word to keep it natural. A few years ago, I moved into a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The building was old, but the rent was affordable and the location was perfect. My neighbors seemed normal. Everyone kept to themselves, and there was an eerie but comfortable silence in the hallways. However, there was one neighbor who stood out, an older man who lived in the unit next to mine. I'd never seen him in person, just heard muffled noises through the walls. Late-night footsteps, the sound of furniture scraping, and soft whispers. At first, I didn't think much of it. It could have been the old pipes, or maybe the man had a TV on low. But then I started noticing something strange. Every time I walked past his door, there would be a faint smell of something metallic. It wasn't always there, but when it was, it lingered. One evening, after a few weeks of this odd behavior, I decided to knock on his door. No one answered, but the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and what I saw froze me in place. The apartment was completely empty, except for a small pile of old newspapers in the corner and some yellowing curtains fluttering by the window. But that wasn't what sent chills down my spine. What caught my attention was the floor. There were strange, dark stains all over it. As I took a step closer, I realized the smell was stronger now, and the stains, they weren't just dirt. I backed out of the apartment, closing the door behind me. I went straight to the building manager and told them about the situation. When they sent maintenance to check the apartment, they found the man's belongings, but there was no sign of him. They never found out where he went. But to this day, whenever I walk past that apartment, the smell still lingers in the hallway, like something just isn't quite right. I don't know what happened to the old man, and I don't think I ever want to find out. The next story, I have chosen from a Reddit group with the permission of the author. Name of author and group I am not mentioning due to privacy reason. He narrates, I've never been very good at explaining things. Whenever I try to get my thoughts and memories out, they come out in random clumps of non-linear mishmash. However, due to recent events and with help from friends and professionals, I have decided the most healthy thing to do is to try to get some of it out in writing. You can't suppress memories forever. Right now, the event I can best recall is the exact night when I began to see him again. I didn't know it was him at the time. It started about 3 months after I had the phone call at work that resulted in an embarrassing breakdown and was forced to stay on unpaid leave until further notice. I'll try to formulate that event into something coherent another day. I had just gotten home from getting groceries. I felt my body ache and complain about my late nights as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, pushing the key in with my fingertips, opening the door with my elbows, and trying not to drop anything. I was greeted with a very loud meow and the rapid footsteps of a little monster coming to see who was at the door. Too bad you don't have any thumbs. You could have me with this, I tell Charlie as I set the bags of groceries down on the counter. Her little orange and white face meowed in response. She hurriedly ran towards the sound of rustling paper bags, curious to see what was found today at the discount bin, and jump inside if there was enough space. I wrestled around with her while trying to get everything out from the bags, and after a bit, I managed to sort various cans of soup and pasta into the once empty cabinets. I put the last bit of food away in my freezer, peeling off red stickers labeled with an expiration date of tomorrow, and then open the window to let the stale air in my apartment out. Trying to keep my eyes open, I shifted quickly through a thick stack of mail before tossing it aside to join a larger pile of unopened envelopes. The keywords and names my mind got used to scanning for weren't there. Charlie popped her head out to look at me and started to purr as if she knew what I was thinking. I thought that after being together this long, she could read my mind and know exactly what I was thinking about, but with how she is, I doubt much really happens inside that brain of hers. Realistically, it was probably just her internal clock telling her it was time to start the daily routine we had worked ourselves into over the past few months. She bounced behind me as I cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, went through my emails, made my daily meal, checked the locks at least 2 times. Those cheap locks always managed to unlatch in the middle of the night, and then cleaned again before it got too dark. Finally, when the sunlight stopped coming through the windows, we retired to the workroom to try and keep ourselves awake as long as possible. I tried anyway. Charlie had no issue dozing off immediately underneath the table as I started to busy myself with small arts and crafts projects. At that time, I had a lot of issues with my sleep pattern. Every time I woke up, I would feel like I had run a marathon. And since I was out of work, I had decided that the best course of action for me was to stay awake as long as I could. It had started shortly after I was let go, so I thought that clearly the lack of my everyday routine must have had something to do with it. As soon as I was able to go back to my routine, I would be able to sleep a full 8 hours again every single night. Until then, I tried everything I could to keep my mind busy. A random video played on my phone beside me. The laptop in front of me was in the middle of some science article I had stopped reading a couple of hours ago, and arranged in a small ring around me were various cups of coffee and bottles of cola I had been unhealthily drinking over the night. I've never had any coffee before in my entire life until around that time, and honestly thought I was experiencing a heart attack the first time I had a cup. However, over a short amount of time, it lost its energizing effect. It turns out coffee also had a limit to how long it could keep a person awake. Focusing on several things strained my eyes heavily. Instead of closing both of them at once and risking falling asleep, every once in a while I would close one eye at a time to give them a bit of a break. I close one of them, put pressure on it with my palm, open it again, and then do the same with the other. Other times I would look up from my desk and stare down the hallway to my bedroom to give my eyes something a bit further away to focus on for a moment. The workroom sat on the other side of my apartment. Separating them was a hallway about 50 feet long, splitting off to the kitchen, living room, and bathroom. During the day, from the other end of the apartment, I can see everything. I could see the edge of my bed, curtains, small nightstand, and the red-lit numbers on my alarm clock. Sometimes in the night, when I sat in my chair and looked up from whatever I was doing, I could still make out the shape of everything in the dark. Even when it was pitch black, it was still familiar to me. I could focus and make out the shapes of the furniture and where everything was supposed to be. The edge of the bed, curtains, nightstand, the red-lit numbers. If I stared and focused hard enough, I could even tell what time it was from where I sat. Every once in a while, though, the shadows would play tricks on me, dancing in weird patterns to make me think I saw something when I hadn't. The red of the alarm clock became eyes instead of numbers, the curtains arms, and the table a small freakish body. When this happens, I would take a deep breath, not panic, and instead tell myself that I have to close my eyes to let them rest a moment before opening them again. When I open them again, I would realize there is nothing there. This was one of those times. I stared too long and started to see something form within the shadows. I groaned and closed both of my eyes, rubbed them with my palms, and then took another look. It didn't help. The shadows at the end of the hall still bent and twisted, playing with my mind. I squinted harder. A heavy pressure bored into my eyelids, threatening to snap them close again. On the other side of my apartment, beyond the open bedroom door, was a wall of darkness completely unfamiliar. Maybe the batteries ran out on my alarm clock. That's why everything looked so confusing. The red of the numbers must have been a sort of reference point for my brain, and now that the clock went out, I'm not able to make out where everything else in the room was. But this was the exact thing I was worried about when I bought the alarm clock. I was afraid that the batteries would go kaput in the middle of the night, and I would wake up late for work. Because of that, I bought one with a cable that I could plug into the wall. My stomach sank even deeper as I sat up in my chair, trying to be more alert. I questioned if I had to unplug it earlier for something when suddenly a shadow shifted in the darkness. A piece of black that was a completely different shade of black had sat itself upwards in the void. The pressure I had felt suddenly squeezed my chest a bit tighter in response. I took a hard, deep breath, struggling to keep my eyes open as I stood up from my desk. At the moment, I felt either a surge of stupidity or braveness, but I wanted to see who or what it was. Suddenly, the shape moved again, rising higher from its current spot and stopping. The burst of energy I had left my body instantly, and I kept my eyes glued to it, not wanting to blink and miss another sudden flinch or movement. I didn't think whoever was there knew that I could see them. I needed to call for help. My phone was charging in the kitchen, and if I was quiet enough, I could sneak by, grab it, and call the police to report an intruder had broken into my home. Of course, that's what it had to be, right? Maybe I forgot to check a lock or left a window open somewhere. I focused hard, forcing my already strained eyes to try to gather more details from stranger. I tried to make out a face, height, or any distinctive, but my exhausted vision twisted the shapes too far. Each limb looked too long to be normal, the legs bent at strange angles, and the arms scrapped the ground. The face, or where its face should have been located, was shrouded in a black indistinguishable from the darkness around it. Carefully, I stepped around my desk, not wanting to take my eyes off of the intruder, when suddenly they moved again. They slid to the right, then tried to take a step but shot their leg too far. It slid out from underneath them, almost sending them toppling over, but suddenly freezing before they hit the floor. With a loud crack and pop, it slipped back up, resetting itself with one leg forward. Panic started to slowly take hold as I stopped fighting against my body. I let my eyes shut and open again and again, hoping each time that the shape would be gone, but it still stood there motionless. Whoever it was at the end of the hallway knew I was there. They moved when I moved, and now the two of us stood frozen, staring each other down. I raised my leg to make another move, and the intruder did the same, raising a leg a bit too high to take a normal step and let it hover in the air. I go to lower my leg, and the intruder lets his fall to the ground, sliding out from under him with a crunch before pulling itself straight up. My mouth fell open. I wanted to shout something intimidating, to lie and tell them I was armed or that the police were already on their way. Anything to break the silence before I planned to reach out and slam the door to my workroom shut. I started to shout, sucking in air and filling my lungs, but before anything got past my throat, the stranger beat me to it. The shadows where its mouth should be snapped open and cracked, sending a wet tear down the hallway, followed by a faint, desperate gasp for air. Meow. My chest jumped so hard at that moment that I thought I had died. I spun around in a panic to see Charlie poke her head around her sleeping spot behind the table, looking just past me. A faint meow comes from the other end of the apartment, making me spin back around to once again see the red glow of my alarm clock. 5:23 in the morning, cold blue rays of daylight forming beyond the curtains. Gradually, the shape of my bed, night table, and curtains slowly come back into view. I take a long, deep breath and rub my temple, leaning back against my desk, and finally close my eyes for longer than a second at a time, giving them the rest that they begged for. Charlie purred and hopped onto the table, rubbing herself against my arm and wanting attention. Bedtimes? Charlie only purrs in response. She's a cat. If someone had broken into the apartment, she would have picked it up and alerted me, no matter how quiet the intruder was. I guess I had no choice anymore. I did everything in my power to avoid it, but when it came to visual and auditory hallucinations, maybe it was time to give in and get some shut-eye. Everyone has a limit, and I had pushed mine too much. I carefully took the little white noise machine in my arms and held her close to my chest, the two of us taking a moment to stare down the hallway together before leaving the room. The dark we were met with was empty and familiar like it always was. How was the story? I really liked it. So, let's move to our next story, which is sent from Florida by a friend of mine. It's quite long one. Let's start with his words. Living 5 miles from Florida's Atlantic coast means salt air bleeds into everything. The sun-bleached siding of our house, peeling like sunburned skin. The tangled mangroves framing the tidal creek behind our property, their roots clutching at briny mud like arthritic fingers. Even the ice cubes in our freezer taste faintly of the ocean, as if the sea had seeped into the tap water while we weren't looking. Dad's 27-foot center console, the Salty Serenity, might as well be a fourth family member. Her hull is pocked with barnacle scars, her vinyl seats cracked like desert earth, but Dad polishes her twice a week with the devotion of a priest tending an altar. Come June, when the pavement starts sweating by 9 a.m., leaving the backyard asphalt shimmering like a mirage, our weekend routines shift. No more strolling Cocoa Beach at sunset, the sand cool and sugared between our toes. No more road trips to Georgia's mountains where the air smells of pine resin instead of decayed jellyfish. Just the Serenity cutting through Mosquito Lagoon's tea-dark water, her twin outboards growling as Dad grins into the wind like a kid gripping a roller coaster bar, his baseball cap flipped backward so the brim doesn't snap off in the gale. That Friday in July clung to us like wet gauze, the kind they'd press over a wound to staunch bleeding. Humidity hung pregnant over the intracoastal, thickening the air until dragonflies moved through it like swimmers fighting a riptide. The dock's wooden planks swept beads of condensation, and the rope lines sagged, limp as dead eels. Cicadas screamed in the palmettos, their drone rising and falling like a theremin's whine. Mom hovered in the kitchen doorway, her knuckles white around a ginger ale can, her seasick armor. She called it, though we all knew the cure wasn't working today. The aluminum dented under her grip, droplets sliding down the sides to pool on the linoleum. She'd worn that same wilted smile when Dad announced the trip, her eyes tracking the Serenity's keys as they jingled in his hand. "Y'all go," she said, too quickly, her voice fraying at the edges. "I'll defrost the conch fritters for when you're back." The freezer hummed in agreement, exhaling a plume of frost as she opened it. Dad didn't need persuading. He was already halfway to the dock, his flip-flops slapping against the warped boards, shouting over his shoulder about a new sandbar he'd spotted near the Spoil Islands. Gonna be glassy out there. Glassy meant flat water, which meant he'd open the throttle wide, let the boat fly until the bow lifted and the world blurred into seagrass and sky, the horizon line trembling like a plucked guitar string. I hesitated, watching Mom press the cold can to her forehead, her eyelids fluttering as condensation trickled down her temple. She shooed me off with a flick of her dish towel, a faded thing patterned with lobsters and anchor knots, but not before I caught the way her gaze snagged on the horizon. Not wary, but hungry, as if she were staring at a ghost ship only she could see, its sails full of the same wind that used to fill her lungs when she'd raced Dad to the channel markers, back when her stomach didn't turn at the smell of diesel and low tide. The salty Serenity sliced into the bay, her cooler packed with Dad's lime-flavored seltzers, cans slick with condensation, their tabs hissing like tiny airlocks, and my mason jar of lemonade, still pulpy with rind the way Mom insists on making it, the bitterness clinging to the back of the throat like a secret. Mosquito Lagoon hummed with July's feverish energy. Jet skis zigzagged like water striders, their wakes crisscrossing into lace, while toddlers shrieked as mullet leapt silver arcs over their inflatable rafts, their scales catching the light like flung nickels. From Sharky's shack, its roof patched with license plates and fishnets sagging with plastic crabs, the tinny thump of Zac Brown band covers drifted across the water, the chorus of knee-deep warring with the guttural croak of bullfrogs in the sawgrass. Dad docked at their warped pier with a captain's flourish, the Serenity's hull kissing the pilings with a groan, and tossed the rope to a sunburned teenager whose shoulders blistered tomato red beneath peeling tattoos of anchor ink. The kid nodded like they'd rehearsed this 100 times, his bare feet gripping the splintered wood with the ease of someone who'd never known shoes. Time dissolved. We ate blackened mahi tacos that burned our tongues, the charred edges crumbling into our laps, their heat cut by dollops of mango salsa so bright it tasted like summer itself. We laughed as pelicans dive-bombed for our discarded lime wedges, their beaks snapping shut with a sound like castanets, wings grazing the water's surface as if testing its temperature. The sun melted us into the vinyl seats, the material sticking to our thighs like warm glue until dusk arrived unannounced. The horizon bled tangerine and violet, the water reflecting the sky's fire like spilled gasoline, iridescent and dangerous. Dad raised his last seltzer in salute, the aluminum crumpled in his fist, condensation dripping onto his wristwatch. "Tonight's that outshine days," he said, his voice roughened by salt and sun, and I clinked my lemonade against his can, the glass ringing hollow. I didn't yet notice how his toast sounded like a warning, how his eyes lingered a beat too long on the darkening east, where the first stars pricked through the bruise-colored sky. Darkness fell with the finality of a theater curtain, the last daylight snuffed out behind the Spoil Islands. Dad queued up his Night Cruisin' playlist, Springsteen's Growl, Seeger's Gravel Road Rasp, that one CCR song he swears every boat needs, and cranked the volume until the bass vibrated in my molars, the speakers buzzing like hornets in a jar. We glided into the unlit stretch beyond the channel markers, where the lagoon widens into a black mirror, the mangroves reduced to jagged cutouts against the moonless sky. The Serenity's running lights painted emerald ripples on the water, their glow dissolving inches below the surface as if the lagoon drank the light whole. The air turned crisp, carrying the sweetness of night-blooming jasmine, thick as syrup, tangled with something sharper, metallic, like a penny held on the tongue. It clung to the back of the throat, a taste that wasn't quite a taste, as the boat pushed farther into the void, the only sound the churn of the engines and the occasional slap of a mullet fleeing our wake. We passed near a lighthouse, a skeletal sentinel perched on Ponce Inlet's crumbling jetty, its iron ribs exposed where storms had gnawed through limestone flesh. Its beam sliced through the dark every 10 seconds, a staccato swish-swish that lit the foam around us in stark, clinical white, bleaching the color from Dad's face and my trembling hands. Shadows leapt and contorted in its glare. Seaweed became grasping fingers. Drifting logs arched like the spines of drowned creatures. The light's pulse throbbed in time with my heartbeat. Each pass, leaving after images burned into my retinas. I gripped the console, the fiberglass edge biting into my palm. "That thing's straight out of a Stephen King novel," I said, too loud, my voice cracking like the gulls screeching overhead. Dad smirked, his face half-lit by the GPS screen's ghostly green glow, the other half drowned in shadow. "Built in 1887, he said, as if reciting a psalm. "Back when this inlet ate ships for breakfast." He adjusted his grip on the wheel, the leather wrap creaking. "Your great-granddad used to supply the keepers. Said they'd trade whiskey for snapper, fresh snapper. Not that freezer burn crap." He nudged me, his calloused hand rough on my shoulder, the salt-stiffened fabric of his shirt scraping my neck. "Relax, kid. Only ghosts out here are the ones we bring with us." His laugh was a dry thing, lost to the growl of the engine, but his thumb tapped the throttle twice, quick and restless. The beams swept over us again. For a heartbeat, the lighthouse's brickwork seemed to ripple, its mortar oozing black as crude oil, rivulets crawling downward like veins. Then darkness swallowed it whole, leaving only the aftertaste of that image, a wet, glistening rot. I blinked, but the tower stood inert again, its cracks and fissures frozen in the brief glare. The air smelled different here, the usual brine undercut by a dankness, like the inside of a storm drain after a flood. Dad killed the engine. The salty Serenity's hum died abruptly, leaving a vacuum of sound so thick I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, the click-click of cooling metal from the outboards. The boat swayed, creaking like an old floorboard, as waves lapped at the hull with wet, open-mouthed kisses. My skin prickled, goose flesh rising despite the humidity. I couldn't stop staring at the lighthouse. Its beam carved the dark into fragments, each pass illuminating the tower's peeling paint, its rusted railing clawing at the sky. It looked less like a guide now, and more like a bone jutting from a grave, something the earth had tried to bury but couldn't quite keep down. Dad rummaged in the cooler for another seltzer, the crack hiss of the tab deafening. "Trust the process," he muttered, though I couldn't tell if he was talking to me or the night itself. Maybe that's why I didn't notice the sound at first, not over Springsteen's growl bleeding from the speakers, not over the Serenity's hull slapping the waves like a restless heartbeat. Then it came again, a scream. Not the distant whoop of a drunk tourist or the theatrical shriek of a gull, but a raw, guttural sound, the kind that shreds vocal cords, that belongs to animals caught in steel traps. It cut through the bass line, sharp as a fillet knife. "Dad, kill the music." I lunged for the stereo, slapping at the volume knob, my palm slipping on its sweat-slick plastic. He flinched, his sunburned face slack with confusion, the pink peeling skin around his eyes crinkling like tissue paper. The speakers went silent. The quiet that followed was suffocating, a wool blanket pressed over the world, smothering even the lap of waves against the hull. "Someone's out there," I whispered. My throat tightened, every hair on my arms standing rigid as porcupine quills. Dad's grin from earlier had vanished. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles bleached white as barnacle shells, as the scream came again. Closer this time, or maybe the water carried it sharper, honed by the lagoon's curved throat. A woman's voice, fraying into a sob, skated across the black water. My eyes found the island, a jagged smudge in the moonlight, half swallowed by mist that coiled like smoke from a doused fire. No boats, no lights, just that ragged silhouette, its shoreline clawed by currents that could capsize a kayak in seconds, that could drag you down to where the crabs pick bones clean. We didn't move, didn't breathe. The Serenity rocked gently, mocking the stillness, her hull creaking like a taunt. I counted the seconds. 10, 20, 40. Nothing. The lagoon stretched empty, a black sheet ironed flat, its surface oily and unbroken. No life jacket bobbed in the swells. No hands broke the surface, fingers splayed like starfish. Only the island, hunched and silent, a place where the water itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to exhale its secrets. Helps. The cry tore through the night, brittle and fractured, the vowels splintering. Dad fumbled for the spotlight, its beam quaking as he swept it over the water, the light catching the iridescent swirl of baitfish fleeing some unseen predator. The island loomed, all jagged coral teeth and spindly sea grape trees, their leaves glinting like knife edges in the stark white glare. "Where are you?" we shouted in unison, our voices thin against the vastness, swallowed by the dark as if the lagoon had no bottom, no end. "Being followed," the reply screamed. "Followed?" My mind snagged on the word. "Are you on the island?" Dad barked, louder now, the spotlight jerking across the shore, illuminating skeletal driftwood and shadows that twitched like living things. Her answer was a scream, a serrated, sustained note that raised the flesh on my neck, that left my eardrums throbbing. Yes. Dad didn't hesitate. The engine roared to life, a feral sound that scattered the quiet, the sudden violence of it sending a cormorant bursting from the reeds in a panic of wings. The Serenity lurched forward, bow slamming into waves as we charged the island, the hull shuddering like it might splinter. The cliffs reared up, pitted limestone glowing bone-white in the spotlight, pockmarks gaping like eye sockets. Dad anchored 20 yards out, the chain grating against rock as breakers hissed, hungry, against the hull, their foam glowing faintly with bioluminescent algae, tiny blue sparks dying as they struck the boat. Up close, the island was a feral thing. Seaweed clung to its rocks like matted hair, reeking of rot and brine. The trees leaned at cruel angles, roots exposed like tendons, their bark sloughing off in leprous patches. No footprints marked the narrow beach, no torn fabric fluttered in the branches. Just wind hissing through sawgrass, a low, wet sound, like the island itself was breathing. We pulled on the boots Dad had stashed in the Serenity's compartment, stiff rubber reeking of mildew, soles treadless as dolphin skin. Climbing out shirtless, the rocks bit into my palms, sharp as crab claws, while the boots slipped on algae-slick stone, each step a gamble. Dad's flashlight beam jutted ahead, a frail yellow circle that deepened the darkness around us, the shadows pooling like spilled ink. "Call out," he demanded, his voice cracking. The beam swept over gnarled trunks, over tide pools glinting like 1,000 watching eyes, their surfaces trembling with the scuttle of translucent shrimp. No one answered. The chill that crept up my spine wasn't the night's doing. It slithered, serpentine, between my ribs. "She could be injured," I said, the words crumbling as they left my lips, dissolving like sand in a receding wave. "Or trapped." Dad's jaw tightened, the tendon flickering like a fishing line under strain. He swung the flashlight beam inland, its light fraying at the edges as it cut through the undergrowth, exposing spiderwebs strung between sea grape leaves, their silk glinting like nooses. We moved in tandem, boots crunching over shells and driftwood, shouting hello into the void. Each call dissolved into the wind, unanswered, the island drinking our voices whole. The ground squelched beneath us, sodden with tidal muck that reeked of sulfur and spoiled eggs. Deeper in, the air turned cloying, salt rot and wet limestone, the stench of something decaying beneath the soil, something too large to name. Mangroves crowded us, their roots knuckling up from the ground like buried skeletons, the bark sloughing off in papery strips. "Can you hear us?" Dad bellowed. The cliffs threw his voice back, warped and watery, as if the island itself were taunting us, mocking our futility. Above, night herons croaked their disapproval, wings snapping through the canopy like wet canvas tearing. The sea hissed, relentless audience to our search, its rhythm syncopated with the ragged tempo of our breathing. Then, a guttural, choked scream. Not distant. Close. Human, but strangled, half-swallowed, as if the mouth that made it were stuffed with kelp. The sound hit me like live wire to the ribs, my muscles seizing. Dad froze, the flashlight trembling in his grip, the beam skittering over roots that now looked like coiled snakes. No words passed between us. We ran. The island fought us. Sawgrass lashed my forearms, drawing blood that welled black in the moonlight. Sand spurs clung to my jeans, their barbs needle-sharp, and my boots skidded on moss-slick rocks, each misstep threatening to twist an ankle. Dad's flashlight beam juddered wildly, carving grotesque shadows from the trees. A hunched figure here, a reaching hand there, all vanishing as the light swept past. My lungs burned, salt and iron coating my tongue. The scream looped in my skull, primal, wrong, propelling me forward even as the terrain turned jagged, cruel, the ground buckling into fissures choked with sea wrack. I stumbled onto the eastern shore, heaving for air, the beam flitting over tide pools alive with scuttling crabs, over boulders crusted with barnacles that yawned like tiny mouths. Nothing. No crumpled form in the surf, no footprints in the muck. Just the moon staring down, cold and dispassionate, and the silence. That silence. It pressed against my eardrums, thick and smug, as if the island had swallowed the woman whole and now licked its lips, sated. Dad caught up, sweat gleaming on his temples like mercury, his chest heaving. He opened his mouth, to curse, to rationalize, but no sound came. The flashlight's beam shrank, dimming, as if the darkness itself were leeching its power, the batteries draining into the hungry earth. We stood gasping, the scream's echo still thrashing in our skulls. Had we imagined this whole thing? The thought slithered, cold and unwelcome. Around us, the mangroves swayed, though the air hung motionless, their roots creaking like arthritic joints. My flashlight trembled as I swung it toward the shore, the plastic casing creaking in my white-knuckled grip. The beam carved a trembling path through the dark, scattering shadows like roaches fleeing a struck match. The light caught on strands of seaweed dangling from mangrove branches, their tendrils swaying though the air hung utterly still. And there, where the surf gnawed at the rocks, foam hissing between jagged teeth, it stood. Not human, not animal. A thing of angles and voids, its silhouette a mockery of anatomy, as if a sculptor had assembled bones at random and called it done. Moonlight glazed its emaciated frame, ribs like scythes curving inward, joints knotted and inverted, legs spiraled as if wrung by giant hands. Its skin, if it was skin, glistened wetly, reflecting the beam in oily streaks, the surface rippling like mercury disturbed by a fingertip. The head lolled backward, neck tendons straining like ship's rigging as it stared into the moon's glare with lidless eyes, pupilless voids that swallowed the light whole. Then, slowly, wrongly, it pivoted toward us. The movement was liquid, boneless, its spine undulating like a sea whip caught in a riptide. The flashlight caught its face, a collapsed star of features. Eyes like pooled mercury, swirling with refracted moonlight. A mouth too small, too precise, a razor-cut slit that peeled open, cartilage crackling like crumpled cellophane as it spoke. "You found me." The voice was a flawless mimicry of the woman's, her panic, her pitch, but warped, as if played through waterlogged speakers. It didn't resonate. It slithered, bypassing the ears to coil directly in the gut, cold and invasive as a swallowed eel. My knees buckled. Dad's grip locked onto my bicep, fingers vice-tight, his nails biting crescents into my skin. Run. No hesitation. No questions. We fled, boots skidding on kelp-slimed rocks, the thing's cries chasing us, sharpening with each step. "Help me," it wailed, each syllable fraying at the edges now, unraveling into something guttural, wetter, the sound of a throat filling with seawater. "Help me." The words splintered, layered with clicks and hisses, a chorus of corrupted voices overlapping, as if a dozen throats had been fused and torn apart. My spine seized a primal recognition, older than language. This wasn't fear. This was prey-knowledge, the hare's certainty that the fox's teeth are already at its neck, that the chase is just ritual. We didn't look back, didn't dare. The island's undergrowth tore at our clothes, thorns biting into wrists, sand spurs embedding in our ankles like fishhooks. Dad's breath sawed in his throat, raw and rhythmic, each gasp flavored with salt and copper. The Serenity's running lights glowed ahead, bobbing on the black water like a mirage, the boat's hull groaning as waves slammed it against the anchor. Behind us, the cries mutated, less words now, more vibration, a subsonic hum that made my molars ache and my vision blur. I risked one glance. The thing stood at the tree line, its body contorted into a crouch, arms elongated, fingers splayed like mangrove roots, tips tapering into hooked spines. It didn't pursue, just watched, head cocked at an impossible angle, as if savoring the taste of our terror, its mouth stretched into a crescent slit that might have been a smile. Or a promise. We spilled into the salty serenity like men fleeing a grenade blast, limbs tangling, boots scuffing the deck's non-slip tread raw. Dad clawed at the anchor line, his fingers slipping on the wet rope, the fibers groaning as if the sea itself fought to keep us tethered. When the anchor finally broke free, it surfaced caked in black sludge that reeked of low-tide rot, the clumps dripping like congealed blood, strands of seagrass tangled in the flukes like hair. Dad jammed the throttle forward. The engine screamed, a feral sound that drowned the island's silence, the RPM needle trembling in the red as foam boiled beneath the stern. Water churned behind us, the wake glowing faintly with bioluminescent algae, a ghostly trail that pulsed as we raced toward open water, the blue-green sparks swirling into shapes that might have been faces or hands. I gripped the gunwale, refusing to look back, but the thing's voice pursued us, crisp as a gunshot across the waves, its timbre flawless, inhumanly precise. "Come back!" It shrieked, its tone now slick, almost musical, a lullaby wrapped in razor wire. "I need help." The words slithered into my ears, stripped of their earlier desperation, each vowel polished to a predatory gleam. This wasn't a plea. It was a performance, a pantomime of distress laced with a giddy, venomous edge, the sound of a child's music box cranked too fast, its melody warping into dissonance. What we encountered that night defies logic. If you're reading this, if you're skimming Florida's barrier islands at dusk, cocktails in hand, laughter spilling over the rails like something the night can't wait to devour, heed this. When the wind carries a cry from some lonely spit of sand, when your gut knots at the too perfect pitch of that "help me," do not answer. Steer clear. Flood the engine. Pray the current drags you anywhere else. Pray harder. Because whatever wears a human voice like ill-fitting skin, whatever peels back the night to show you teeth masquerading as a smile, it isn't lost. It doesn't want help. It wants you alive, bleeding, afraid. So this was it. How you felt with the story. Let's read the next one, which is sent from Ohio by Azah. She say, "The last few winters had been pretty mild, all things considered. I grew up with parents who lived through the blizzard of '78 and talked about it any chance they got. My dad was a little bit of a prepper. We always had a generator, kerosene heater, and shelves full of canned food in case of an emergency. My parents relocated to Florida 2 years ago. They seemed to enjoy the warmer weather and beaches. They only visited my siblings and I in Ohio during the summer. We were of course free to visit them in Florida anytime. Unlike most of my family, I really didn't mind the winter. I wasn't particularly sensitive to cold and enjoyed the way the world slowed down, at least after the holidays. My phone rang, waking me up from a dead sleep. I rubbed my eyes, annoyed that anyone was calling at 8 o'clock sharp on a Sunday. "Hey, Dad," I answered. "Hey, son, how are you?" I yawned. "Pretty tired. Is everything okay?" I asked. Of course, I was hoping his call was nothing serious, but at the same time, I wasn't very happy about getting woke up so early. Dad must have sensed the slight annoyance in my voice. "Sorry to call so early, but I wanted to give you a heads up about the cold weather coming up." I was confused. Winter weather was typical in Ohio. Obviously, some years were worse than others, but it wasn't like some of the southern states where the world shuts down for an inch of snow. "Okay, what's up?" I asked. Dad immediately launched into a long explanation about how this weekend would be some of the coldest weather Ohio's ever seen and gave me tips on protecting my home and car from the effects of the cold. I silently nodded along, too tired to really register a lot of it. All in all, I knew the drill. Change the furnace filter. Don't alternate temperatures on the thermostat. Let the water drip to avoid pipes freezing. Keep emergency supplies on hand in case of an outage. I know you know all this, son. It's just the dad in me wanting to remind you. I began to feel guilty. Here I was annoyed at getting a call so early, but all he was doing was looking out for me, even though I'm 28 and several states away. "Thanks, Dad, I got it." "Hey, one more thing," he said. There was long pause, then he hesitated. "The world gets a little, well, let's just say, things can get a little different when the weather gets like this, especially for days at a time. Double that if the power goes out. You can't be too careful." This felt ominous, but I assumed he was talking about crimes like looting and break-ins. I assured him I could handle it, then promptly got off the phone to get some more sleep. Later that evening, I remembered what my dad had told me. The weather alerts were already showing up on my phone. If anything, The forecast was only getting worse. Snow and ice were predicted on top of the extreme cold. I made a trip to the local farm supply store and picked up an extra flashlight and some more canned food. I was trying to avoid the grocery store at all costs, as it was usually mobbed right before any kind of winter storm. Before heading to bed, I made sure to let the taps drip, changed the furnace filter, and charged my extra power banks. My boss called and let me know not to come in tomorrow. I was pleasantly surprised. Work hadn't been canceled for weather since I'd worked there. I put on a movie and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to my alarm. Of course, I hadn't remembered to turn it off. I grumbled and shut it off. The house felt chilly. I got up to turn up the heat when I realized the lights were all off. Power was out already. I looked outside. Snow blanketed the yard and my car and continued to fall. I opened the curtains to let in the natural light and located my kerosene heater. I figured I would wait a while to start it to conserve fuel. I had a pretty decent day. I stayed off my phone as much as possible to save the remaining battery. I did check in with a few friends and family who luckily were all okay. Everyone in the village was without power and no one knew when it was coming back on. I spent most of the day cleaning and reading. I decided to head to bed early. I needed to save the candles, and there wasn't much to do anyway. My dog, Arlo, started barking. He was still a puppy and was always on edge during bad weather, so I didn't think too much of it. But just as I was heading to bed, I heard a faint knock at the front door. It was so light that if I hadn't happened to be standing a few feet away, I wouldn't have heard it. I froze. By this point, Arlo had retreated to the bedroom. I debated opening the door. I lived out of town, and although I had neighbors, they were pretty far away, definitely out of earshot. But I knew if I was stranded or broke down in this weather, I would want someone to help me, so I took a deep breath and opened the door. A woman who looked roughly my age stood there in a black coat and jeans covered in snow. Her lips were almost blue from the cold. She stammered something about being lost. I glanced around and didn't see a car or anyone else. I hesitantly invited her in. I was normally smarter than this. I knew better than to let strangers into my home, especially after dark. But this felt like a life or death situation. I handed her a quilt as she sat on the couch. I tried to figure out where she was going, but her answers were vague and non-committal. She barely said anything at all. From what I could gather, she didn't have a phone or car and was headed home, but didn't seem to know where home was. "Is there someone you can call?" I asked. She nodded. I unlocked my phone and handed it to her. She slowly typed in a number, then waited. Then closed the phone and handed it to me. "No service," she said. I nodded. Last I had checked, I was still able to use my phone and data, but maybe now it was out due to the weather. I heard Arlo's low growl from the bedroom. I tried to call him over to calm him, but he wouldn't budge. "What's your name?" I asked. Blaine Quinn," she responded. I offered her water and a granola bar, and she accepted. I brought her the snack and drink, and told her I'd be right back. Once I was out of sight, I Googled her name out of curiosity. No social media or criminal records appeared, but something else did. She was listed as a missing person a few counties over. She'd been missing for almost a year. I tried calling my brother, but the call wouldn't go through. I tried calling the police too, but that call didn't go through either. I checked my call history to see what number she dialed. It appeared to be a bunch of digits, probably at least 15 in what looked like random order with no area code. Frustrated, I put my phone back in my pocket and returned to the living room. Blaine was gone. The front door was wide open and snow and cold blew into the foyer. "Damn it!" I exclaimed, shivering. I looked outside, and there was no trace of her. Oddly enough, not even footprints. I stepped outside and called out to her with no response. I shut the door and deadbolted it. I paced for a few minutes trying to figure out what to do. If I didn't look for her, she could freeze to death. She was obviously disoriented and likely in danger. Frustrated at the prospect of having to go back outside, I put my boots and coat on. My car was covered in a thick layer of snow and ice. I could barely get the door open. It wouldn't start. I cursed and sat my head on the steering wheel. I checked again for phone reception, but still had none. I walked up and down the street, calling out for Blaine. The walk was a cold hell. The icy breeze burnt my eyes and throat. My hands and feet were going numb despite wearing gloves and winter boots. I decided to head home. There was no point in getting frostbite to find someone who didn't want to be found. But I couldn't let go of the sick feeling that I could be the only thing standing between Blaine and hypothermia. As I trudged home, darker thoughts clouded my mind. What if Blaine was kidnapped and the perpetrators were using her to lure in new victims to be robbed or worse? I tried to push this out of my mind. I put on my warmest thermals and pajamas once I got home. Arlo was still on edge, so I petted him until he drifted off to sleep. My journey to sleep wasn't as easy. Every time I started to drift off, I immediately pictured Blaine, lost in the woods, shivering and crying. Finally, I fell into a more restful, dreamless sleep. My eyes shot open to the shrill sound of Arlo's bark. It was almost 2 a.m. I shushed him, but he wouldn't stop. I listened. In between barks, I heard a scratching noise. The sound was coming from my bedroom window. Probably some kind of animal, I reasoned. Still half asleep, and not using my best judgment, I peered through the blinds. At first, I couldn't see anything in the darkness. But just as I was about to go back to bed, I noticed movement. My eyes adjusted rapidly, as if kicking into survival mode. Another human eye met mine. I cursed and jumped back. I could see the outline of a man on the other side of the window. Ice and snow glinted from his eyelashes and beard. I turned away, frantically reaching for my flashlight. The strange sound of fingernails scratching on the ice-covered window filled the room. "Who are you?" I yelled. There was no response. I called out again, but again, he did not respond. I debated what to do. The man clearly looked like he was in trouble, but I also had a hard time believing anyone trying to pry open a window on a random house had good intentions. The scratching sound finally stopped. I waited a few seconds, then opened the blinds and shined my flashlight. What I saw was gruesome. The man I'd seen standing at my window only a few minutes before was still as a statue, entire body covered in ice, including his eyes, which stared forward with no movement. No breath escaped his lips. He was frozen solid. I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I opened my eyes. I was laying in my bed. My phone was ringing. I sighed with relief. It was a dream. My brother's name lit up my phone screen. "Hello?" I answered. The reception was very choppy, and I could only hear every other word. I was able to gather that he and his family were trying to drive to my house but broke down. I immediately sat up and stumbled around my room, looking for my clothes. Barely able to hear anything over the static, I frantically tried to get their location. My brother had 2 young children, 1 toddler and 1 infant. I had let them know they could stay with me if the power went out if they ran out of fuel. Finally, I was able to understand they were close to the pond. The pond was within walking distance from my house, and I often took Arlo for walks there when it was nicer out. I ended the call and donned my winter gear once more. I packed an extra flashlight and headed out. The walk to the pond normally took 5 minutes, but it took me almost 15 minutes because of the snow and wind. I finally approached the pond, but saw no sign of their car. I repeatedly tried to call him, but the call kept dropping. I circled the pond, looking for any sign of my brother and his family. I hoped that he would know better than to walk away from the car, but maybe he went ahead to get help. "Help me." I heard a soft voice. It sounded like a child, but it wasn't either of my nephews. I paused. "Help me," I heard it again. The tone of voice didn't seem to match the urgency of being stranded in this freezing hellscape. It was monotone, devoid of emotion or urgency. I continued around the pond when I hit a patch of ice. I slipped and fell, landing only a few inches from the pond. I knew getting water anywhere on my body right now could lead to hypothermia. I slowly pulled myself up, trying not to slip again. But then I felt something around my ankle. I turned around to see a pale face of what looked like a young boy poking out of the water. Ice and snow covered his face and hair. Despite being in freezing water, he didn't shiver and his movements were slow and deliberate. His eyes were pitch black and his face was so unnaturally pale that the snow and moonlight seemed to reflect off of it. He pulled my ankle, trying to pull me into the freezing water. I frantically kicked and dug my gloved fingers into the snow, pulling away. Finally, I broke free. I heard frantic movement in the water but couldn't bring myself to turn and see if he was following me. I frantically ran home, well, as close to running as one can when your feet are completely numb and the ground is covered in snow and ice. I fell a few times but luckily was able to get back up. Finally, I reached the front door. I was out of breath and felt weak. My vision tunneled and I collapsed in my entryway. I woke up to a weird sensation on my cheek. "Stop it, Arlo," I mumbled as I opened my eyes. Sure enough, Arlo was licking my face. I glanced over to see my brother as well as his family, sitting in my living room. "Oh, thank God you're awake," exclaimed my brother. I sat up, confused. He explained to me that he noticed a bunch of missed calls from me early in the morning, and when he couldn't reach me, they came out to check on me only to find me collapsed in the doorway. He appeared confused when I brought up him calling me from the pond. "We were asleep until 5. That's when I saw your calls and headed out here." I nodded. I checked my call history and sure enough, there wasn't an incoming call from him at 2 this morning. His wife speculated that maybe I hit my head.
I went along with this. It would explain a lot.
After resting for a bit, I excused myself to my room and opened the blinds. The bright sunlight glinted through the ice, revealing the scratch marks.
So guys, it was last story of today.
I hope you will like it.
If you want to share your stories with me,
share on the email belladarktales@gmail.com, also mentioned in description. I will love to read them here. Like today's stories. Need your support to grow. Subscribe the channel and press the bell icon to get notification for new stories. Until next time, remember, the night is always watching. This is Bella, signing off.